Welcome to Psych Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jessica Rabin, a licensed clinical psychologist. If you are a mental health professional, student in the social science field, or just interested in psychology and mental health, this podcast is for you. Although topics discussed on this podcast are similar to therapy, Psych Talk is not a replacement for therapy and is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So let's dive into today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to Psych Talk, and thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Before we dive into today's episode, I first want to thank you all once again for being with me and continuing to listen to this podcast. If you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen a post about this, but back in May, Million Podcasts and FeedSpot released various lists regarding best podcasts. For those unfamiliar, Million Podcasts is a podcast database, and FeedSpot is a content reader and brand monitoring platform that consolidates blogs, news, websites, podcasts, and YouTube channels into a single organized feed. So I saw some of the therapist content creators I have connected with post about how they or their podcasts were featured on one of these lists. So I decided for fun to see if Psych Talk was on any. And y'all, I was blown away. Not only was Psych Talk ranked, it was not just ranked on one list, but 5. So on Millions podcasts, Psych Talk was on the best 100 psychology podcasts in the US at number 26. Best 40 clinical psychology podcasts in the US ranked at number 7. Best 100 mental health podcasts in the US ranked at number 60. And best 100 self-help podcasts in the US ranked at 94. And then on FeedSpot, Psych Talk was ranked number 2 for 25 best podcasts for psychology students. As I said in my Instagram post, I am not sure in the grand scheme of podcasting how much these charts actually mean. However, it was an honor to see Psych Talk ranked on so many charts. And as I always say, this podcast would be nothing without you all. So thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing to the ratings, reviews, listenership to get me on to those podcast ranking lists. So if you haven't already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast or share it with someone who you think may enjoy it or benefit from it, as you all are what keeps this podcast going. So now that that's out of the way, the second thing I want to say is Happy Pride Month. So every year on this podcast, I try to put out at least one episode during Pride Month, which is June, which we are now in, related to LGBTQ mental health. So as a refresher, Pride Month is currently celebrated each year in the month of June to honor the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in Manhattan. The Stonewall Uprising was a tipping point for the gay liberation movement in the United States. Celebrations include pride parades, picnics, parties, workshops, symposia, and concerts, and LGBTQ+ Pride Month events attract millions of participants around the world. Memorials are held during this month for those members of the community who have been lost to hate crimes or HIV or AIDS. And the purpose of the commemorative month is to recognize the impact that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals have had on history, locally, nationally, and internationally. So this year, for this episode, I am going to be talking about conversion therapy. And yes, a lot of times I like to talk about positive things related to LGBTQ+ individuals. However, conversion therapy is something that has been in the news intermittently over the past year, and I'll talk about why in a few minutes. However, when media outlets were first covering conversion therapy back in October of 2025, I started drafting a podcast episode to discuss it. However, as I said in my last solo episode, life happened, and I have also had so many amazing guests on the podcast that I never got around to finishing the episode. But since October, we have more information about why conversion therapy is making headlines, and with it being June, I figured it would be an appropriate time to put out this episode. So with that being said, let's dive into today's episode. So first and foremost, what is conversion therapy? Before I get into why it has been making news headlines, it is important to first define what we're even talking about. So, conversion therapy, also known as reparative therapy, are interventions alleged to alter same sex attractions or an individual's gender expression with the specific aim to promote heterosexuality as the preferable outcome. So, for individuals whose gender identity is incongruent with their sex anatomy, efforts to change their core gender identity have also been described and more recently incorporated under the conversion therapy rubric. These interventions are provided under the false premise that homosexuality and gender diverse identities are pathological. They are not. The absence of pathology means there is no need for conversion or any other similar intervention. Additionally, conversion therapy is condemned by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, American Counseling Association, National Association of Social Workers, among other professional associations. So, why is conversion therapy making headlines? On Tuesday, October 7th, 2025, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in Childs versus Salazar, which concerns a challenge to Colorado's ban on conversion therapy for young people. Kaylee Childs is a therapist and practicing Christian in Colorado Springs, and she argues that the ban, so to clarify, Colorado bans conversion therapy being performed on minors. So Childs was arguing that the ban violates her right to free speech because it imposes a, quote, a gag order on counselors, end quote. Colorado, however, argues that the ban merely regulates the treatments that mental health professionals can provide because conversion therapy has been found to be, quote, unsafe and ineffective, end quote. The majority conservative Supreme Court appeared largely sympathetic to Childs during the Tuesday hearing, so that's the October 7th hearing. But several justices suggested that rather than striking the law down outright, the court should send the case back to the lower courts for them to take a closer look at whether the law passes constitutional muster. Then, on March 31st, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 8-1 against the Colorado law that prohibited licensed mental health professionals from providing conversion therapy to minors. So the case, once again, Childs versus Salazar, centered on whether the state could restrict certain counseling conversations aimed at changing a minor's sexual orientation or gender identity. So some key points from the March 31st ruling include the court held that Colorado's law violated the First Amendment, concluding it restricted counselors' speech based on viewpoint. The majority, written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, said that the statute regulated what therapists could say, which triggered a strict constitutional scrutiny. The court determined the state's attempt to frame the ban as a regulation of professional conduct was insufficient because the therapy involved speech rather than physical treatment. Justice Brown Jackson issued the lone dissent, arguing states should be able to regulate harmful healthcare practices and protect minors. So the ruling may affect similar bans in more than 20 other states, putting them at risk for legal challenges. Supporters of the decision say that the decision protects free speech and religious expression in counseling. Critics, including medical and LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, warn that it could weaken protections for youth from practices widely considered harmful. Now, the ruling did not make conversion therapy legal in all 50 states, which was a common piece of misinformation spreading across social media after this decision. However, understandably, many people were concerned about this ruling and the implications it may have on protections that are put in place for LGBTQ+ youth when it comes to conversion therapy. However, before I get into some of the concerns and criticisms of this ruling, which I will get to towards the end of this episode, I think it's important to first share what conversion therapy entails, its effectiveness, and about conversion therapy bans so we have full context or as much context as possible before hearing the criticisms. So, what does conversion therapy entail? Conversion therapy can include various painful forms of aversion therapy, ranging from hypnosis to inducing vomiting or paralysis to administering electric shocks while showing the individual homoerotic images. In extreme cases, it may include surgical and hormonal interventions which result in castration. More typically, however, conversion therapy focuses on prayer, talk, and behavioral therapy attempts to diminish the individual's same sex attractions or gender expression through shame and force adherence to strict gender roles. So, if we're going to break these down into like subcategories, from a psychotherapy standpoint, talk therapy is the most widely used conversion therapy intervention. Some techniques, so to speak, are teaching stereotypical masculine or feminine behaviors, or the individual may use hypnosis to try to change thought patterns for same-sex attraction. Another commonly used method is called aversion therapy, where people are exposed to painful or uncomfortable sensations like electric shocks and nausea or paralysis causing drugs, as I mentioned a few moments ago, in hopes of forming a negative association with the person's attractions or identity to correct it. Then, if we look at medical interventions, these may include medicines, hormones, or steroid therapies. In extreme cases, gender affirming surgeries are done to quote unquote neutralize sexual orientation, especially among transgender individuals. There are also faith-based approaches that are performed by clergy or other spiritual advisors that may include using anti-gay slurs and prayers. And in severe cases, it may include beating, shackling, food deprivation, and even exorcism. So now that we have an idea of what conversion therapy is and what the practices look like, what does the research say about this quote unquote therapy? Well, the scientific consensus is that conversion therapy is ineffective and can result in significant long-term psychological harm. In 2009, a task force of the American Psychological Association undertook a thorough review of the existing research on the efficacy of conversion therapy. Their report noted that there was very little methodology sound research on sexual orientation change efforts, or SOCEs. Throughout this episode, you may hear me refer to it as conversion therapy or SOCEs. I'm referring to the same thing. And that the results of scientifically valid research indicate that it is unlikely that individuals will be able to reduce same-sex attractions or increase other sex attractions through SOCE. In addition, the task force found that, quote, there are no methodologically sound studies of recent SOCE that would enable the task force to make a definitive statement about whether or not recent SOCE is safe or harmful and for whom, end quote. A 2020 review study in Clinical Psychology, Science and Practice found that reported success claims often contain methodological limitations, such as biased recruitment or retrospective design, that weaken the validity or prevent the generalizability of results. Many studies report negative outcomes associated with SOCE and GICE, which is gender intervention change efforts, such as depression, relationship dysfunction, and increased homonegativity. A 2015 study in the Journal of Counseling Psychology surveyed 1,612 people who underwent sexual orientation change efforts and found that only 3.2% reported even a slight change in sexual orientation. Some of the identified mental health outcomes in the research include decreased self-esteem, increased shame, increased depression and anxiety, increased psychological distress, increased substance use, and increased suicidality. Additionally, research identifies a range of post-traumatic responses, loss of connection to community, damaged familial relationships, self-blame, and guilt. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Homosexuality found that youth whose parents attempted to change their sexual orientation at home and through therapists or religious leaders reported 3 times greater likelihood of high levels of depression, suicide attempts, lower educational attainment, lower income levels, and reduced life satisfaction in young adulthood. Similarly, adults who had been exposed to GICE at any point in their life reported increased distress and twofold higher odds of lifetime suicidal attempts, as found in a 2020 study published in JAMA Psychiatry. Additionally, if we look more broadly at the research on rejection or discrimination of LGBTQ plus individuals, which conversion therapy can be conceptualized as, LGBTQ plus individuals who are rejected or discriminated against are 8 times more likely to report having attempted suicide, almost 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression, more than 3 times as likely to use illegal drugs, and 3 times more likely to be at high risk for HIV and other STDs. Additionally, other studies have found individuals who have undergone conversion therapy report it was a waste of time and money, it increased their distance from God and the church, and worsened their familial relationships. Further, conversion therapy is overall ineffective in changing one's sexual orientation or gender identity. Thus, not only does it not have the outcome it is intended to, it causes harm to individuals in the process. Further, if we look at the financial aspect of things, a 2022 review published in JAMA Pediatrics estimated the total annual cost of SOCE and GICE in the US could reach an annual economic burden of $9.23 billion when the associated harms, substance misuse, and suicide attempt costs were all considered. So, as I mentioned a few moments ago, I have been using the term conversion therapy. I also introduced the terms SOCE and GICE. And conversion therapy is the term most people are familiar with, but I hope by now you recognize that these practices are not therapy at all. It's just the term used. And so the American Psychiatric Association refers to conversion therapy techniques as sexual orientation change efforts, SOCE, or gender identity change efforts, GICE, to differentiate them from evidence-based forms of therapy. So basically taking the term therapy out of what is being done because it is not therapy. However, providers, typically those who are unlicensed, can often disguise these terms they use to avoid being found as administering these quote-unquote therapies. So I wanted to share some of those terms here. So some of these terms may include sexual attraction fluidity exploration in therapy, otherwise known as SAFE-T, SAFE-T. Eliminating, reducing, or decreasing frequency or intensity of unwanted same-sex attraction, reparative therapy, sexual reorientation efforts, ex-gay ministry, promoting healthy sexuality, addressing sexual addictions and disorders, sexuality counseling, encouraging relational and sexual wholeness, and healing sexual brokenness. So I was honestly unaware of some of these terms until I was doing research for this episode. So I wanted to share with anyone listening in case you come across these terms, and then you will have a better idea of what the individual is actually doing. So next I want to talk about organizational positions on conversion therapy. As I mentioned earlier in the episode when defining what conversion therapy is, I mentioned that many major medical and other professional organizations have condemned the practices of sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. Many national organizations representing millions of licensed mental health and medical professionals, as well as educators and advocates, came together to express their professional and scientific consensus on the inefficacy and detrimental nature of such practices. I am not going to read every single medical organization's statement in this podcast episode, but I will include a link in the show notes for anyone interested in reading the different opinions of different organizations. But I am going to read some here. So starting with the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, quote, "The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry finds no evidence to support the application of any therapeutic intervention operating under the premise that a specific sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression is pathological. Furthermore, based on the scientific evidence, the AACAP asserts that such conversion therapies or other interventions imposed with the intent of promoting a particular sexual orientation and/or gender as a preferred outcome lack scientific credibility and clinical utility. Additionally, there is evidence that such interventions are harmful. As a result, conversion therapy should not be part of any behavioral health treatment of children and adolescents." End quote. Next, the American Academy of Pediatrics states, quote, "Confusion about sexual orientation is not unusual during adolescence. Counseling may be helpful for young people who are uncertain about their sexual orientation or for those who are uncertain about how to express their sexuality and might profit from an attempt at clarification through a counseling or psychotherapeutic initiative. Therapy directed specifically at changing sexual orientation is contraindicated, since it can provoke guilt and anxiety while having little or no potential for achieving changes in orientation." The American Medical Association says, quote, "Our AMA opposes the use of reparative or conversion therapy that is based upon the assumption that homosexuality per se is a mental disorder, or based upon the a priori assumption that the patient should change his or her homosexual orientation." And then we have the American Psychological Association. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's pretty long, but I will read part of it, which says, quote, "Be it further resolved that the American Psychological Association concludes that there is insufficient evidence to support the use of psychological interventions to change sexual orientation." End quote. So next I want to talk about conversion therapy bans. I mentioned this earlier when talking about the Childs case because the whole premise of that case was the counselor Childs was saying that Colorado's ban on conversion therapy of minors violates her First Amendment rights. So conversion therapy is currently banned for minors in 23 states and Washington, D.C. So at the time of this episode recording, which I'm recording in May 2026, even though it is coming out in June 2026, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Utah, Virginia, Vermont, Washington, Wisconsin, and the District of Columbia all have laws or regulations protecting youth from conversion therapy. 8 of these states have laws or regulations that were enacted under Republican governors, and I'll get back to that point in a moment. So a growing number of municipalities also have enacted similar protections, including at least 70 cities and counties in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Washington, and Wisconsin. Arizona, North Carolina, North Dakota, and Virginia, plus Puerto Rico, restricts but does not prohibit licensed healthcare providers from subjecting minors to conversion therapy. 17 states, Alaska, Arkansas, Idaho, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Texas, West Virginia, and Wyoming have no state law or policy about conversion therapy. And 6 states, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, South Carolina, and Tennessee, have state laws, budget, or court rulings that prohibits or deters local level laws protecting youth from conversion therapy. So when looking at the youth in the state it affects, what this breaks down to is 51% of LGBTQ plus youth ages 13 to 17 live in states that prohibit licensed healthcare providers from subjecting minors to conversion therapy. 8% of LGBTQ plus youth ages 13 to 17 live in states that restrict but do not prohibit licensed healthcare providers from subjecting minors to conversion therapy. 25% of LGBTQ plus youth ages 13 to 17 live in a state with no state law or policy about conversion therapy, and 16% of LGBTQ plus youth ages 13 to 17 live in states that prohibit or deter local level laws protecting youth from conversion therapy. So if we look at this as a whole, over half of the states in the US have some type of ban or restriction against conversion therapy for youth, highlighting its harm. Additionally, the fact that some of these regulations were put into place by Republican governors highlights how protecting our youth from harmful practices is not a partisan issue and should not be viewed as such. Additionally, globally, around 13 countries have some ban or regulations against licensed mental health clinicians practicing conversion therapy, including Brazil, Norway, Argentina, and Germany. So now that we have all that information, I want to circle back to the March 31st Supreme Court ruling about conversion therapy. I want to reiterate that the question the court had to base their decision on was if Colorado's ban on conversion therapy for minors violates a counselor's freedom of speech. So basically, if it violates the First Amendment, which they determined it did. However, many individuals and groups are concerned about the potential ripple effects of this ruling. For example, the Human Rights Campaign highlighted how the, quote, court overruled best practice medical guidelines, allowing kids to be subjected to harmful, abusive, and discredited attempts to convert their gender identity or sexual orientation by state licensed mental health practitioners, end quote. And the Human Rights Campaign president, Kelly Robinson, released the following statement. Quote, today's reckless decision means more American kids will suffer. The court has weaponized free speech in order to prioritize anti-LGBTQ plus bias over the safety, health, and well-being of children. So-called conversion therapy is pseudoscience, not real therapy. It has been condemned by every mainstream medical and mental health association and harms families, traumatizes children, and robs people of their faith communities. It is cruel and should never be offered under the guise of legitimate mental health care. To undermine protections that keep kids and families safe from these abusive practices is shocking, and our children deserve better. Our fight is far from over. We remain committed to protecting children against these abusive practices that tear apart families and will continue to work alongside our coalition partners to ensure that no kid has to be subjected to guilt, coercion, and rejection as they seek help to better understand themselves and grow. In response to this court ruling, the American Psychiatric Association released the following statement. Quote, the American Psychiatric Association, APA, is deeply concerned with the Supreme Court's decision in Childs versus Salazar will potentially harm many LGBTQ plus individuals, particularly minors, who will no longer be protected by state laws against conversion therapy. Being LGBTQ plus is not a mental illness or disorder. Conversion therapy, efforts to change sexual orientation and gender identity, is not a legitimate therapeutic treatment. Leading healthcare entities, the APA among them, have concluded that these are potentially harmful, discredited practices and are not supported by scientific evidence. We urge the families of LGBTQ plus individuals, faith-based institutions, and therapists to avoid these harmful practices. Similarly, the American Psychological Association released the following statement. Quote, APA is deeply concerned by the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that Colorado's law banning conversion therapy on minors may violate mental health professionals' First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. In directing to the 10th Circuit to reconsider the case under a stricter constitutional standard, the court's decision leaves open the question of whether states can still enact laws that protect patients from harmful therapeutic practices delivered through talk therapy. This is likely to have far-reaching implications for consumer safety and professional regulation. Additionally, multiple amicus briefs were submitted by professional organizations in response to this ruling. So, for those unfamiliar, an amicus brief is a legal document submitted to an appellate court by an individual or organization that is not party to the lawsuit. Its purpose is to provide the court with expertise, arguments, or perspectives that the main parties may have not addressed. So, as you can see, although this ruling was one about free speech, the potential implications of this ruling are concerning to many professional organizations and individuals alike. So, with all that being said, if you have been listening to this episode and you're asking yourself, what can you do to get more states to ban this harmful practice? Here are some suggestions. First, advocate for local and state bans. So contact your local and state representatives and demand legislation protecting minors from these non-evidence-based harmful practices, especially if you live in a state where there are no protections for minors. If you are interested in tracking any current bills on conversion therapy, you can go to the Movement Advancement Project Tracker or MAP tracker. I will also link that in the show notes. You can support advocacy organizations such as the Trevor Project, PFLAG, and the Born Perfect campaign, among others. These organizations are actively working towards ending the practice of conversion therapy, both nationally and internationally. You can report practitioners who are engaging in conversion therapy. So if you live in a state that has laws banning conversion therapy for minors, not only is the practitioner engaging in a practice that is not evidence-based and likely not supported by their governing licensing board, they are also breaking the law. However, if you live in a state that does not have a ban, but it is a licensed professional engaging in the practice, it is still worthwhile to report them to their board as they are likely violating their ethics code. If the individual does not hold a license, this can be trickier because they don't have a governing board or code of ethics they have to abide by. However, you can also report them to the Born Perfect campaign, as this initiative gathers legal experts and survivors to shut down operators of conversion therapy. You can also amplify the voices of survivors of conversion therapy. You can share their stories and their firsthand accounts to ensure their voices and experiences are heard. And lastly, you can amplify the medical consensus that conversion therapy practices are harmful and ineffective. I highlighted a few condemnations in this episode, but recognize that every major medical, psychiatric, and psychological organization condemns these practices. This is also a good point to bring up when contacting your legislators regarding conversion therapy bans for minors. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to acknowledge that this episode has been very one-sided in the sense that I really only talked about the harms and ineffectiveness of conversion therapy. However, that is because there is no credible scientific evidence that conversion therapy is helpful. If you know me, if you follow me on social media, or if you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, you know I like to be as thorough and as nuanced as possible, which includes presenting all the evidence I can in a 30 to 45-minute podcast episode to give you a comprehensive overview of whatever the subject matter is that I'm talking about. But the reality is, when it comes to conversion therapy, I cannot present the quote-unquote other side because the other side has no credible support other than individual accounts from people, likely those who perform conversion therapy practices themselves, went through conversion therapy and are suppressing desires and say it was effective. There is no evidence that conversion therapy works. And as I mentioned earlier, with regard to research, reported success claims often contain methodological limitations such as biased recruitment or retrospective design that weaken the validity or prevent the generalizability of results. So even the quote unquote research that shows it's effective has methodological flaws suggesting that it's not, at least in the grand scheme of things. So, therefore, in sum, conversion therapy is an outdated, harmful, and ineffective practice that aims to change one's sexual orientation or gender identity. The practice is not evidence-based and is condemned by every major professional, medical, and mental health association due to the severe harm it causes. So that is all I have for you for today's episode of Psych Talk. I hope you found this episode informative. Please share it with anyone you think needs to hear it or would find it informative. As I said earlier, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. That is what helps keep it growing. Happy Pride Month once again, and I will catch you in the next episode. Bye. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Psych Talk. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. Don't forget to follow me on all socials at Jessica Lee, PhD, and the podcast at Psych Talk Podcast on Instagram.